On February 1, 1959, 9 experienced hikers took their final photograph together. They were smiling, bundled in thick winter gear, standing against the white expanse of the Ural Mountains. Within hours, all 9 would be dead. But this wasn't an avalanche, a bear attack, or a simple case of exposure. This was something else. Something so inexplicable that even the Soviet government, known for its iron grip on truth, couldn't manufacture a believable explanation. The image, recovered weeks later from a camera frozen in the snow, would become one of the most haunting documents of the 20th century. Because what happened next defied logic, defied science, and defied every known law of survival in the wilderness. Now, over 6 decades later, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in human history. And what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about that frozen mountain. They called themselves the Dyatlov Group, named after their leader, Igor Dyatlov. At 23 years old, Igor was a 5th-year student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, studying radio engineering. He was methodical, experienced, and had led multiple winter expeditions before. His peers described him as cautious, even obsessive about safety protocols. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all in their early 20s, except for one. Alexander Zolotaryov, 37, was a World War II veteran and the oldest member. He had joined the expedition at the last minute, a decision that would later fuel conspiracy theories about his true purpose on the mountain. There was Zinaida Kolmogorova, a bright economics student known for her sharp wit and fearless spirit. Rustem Slobodin, an engineer with a quiet intensity. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both close friends who worked in nuclear facilities. Lyudmila Dubinina, the only woman besides Zina, a passionate economics student with a love for poetry. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, whose French surname hinted at his family's revolutionary past. Semyon Zolotaryov, the veteran. And finally, Alexander Kolevatov, a quiet physics student. 10 had originally planned to make the journey, but Yuri Yudin fell ill 2 days into the trek and turned back. That decision saved his life. For decades afterward, Yudin would be haunted by survivor's guilt, spending the rest of his days trying to piece together what happened to his friends. The expedition's goal was ambitious but achievable for experienced hikers. Reach Otorten Mountain, a peak in the northern Urals, and return within 3 weeks. The route was classified as Category 3, the most difficult designation in Soviet mountaineering. Success would earn them a prestigious certification. They departed from the city of Sverdlovsk on January 23, 1959, traveling by train, then truck, then finally on foot with sleds carrying their supplies. Their last confirmed contact with civilization came on January 28, when they reached a small settlement called Vizhay. They left messages, bought bread, and joked with locals. Everything seemed routine. By February 12th, Igor Dyatlov was expected to send a telegram confirming their safe return. The telegram never came. At first, no one was particularly concerned. Delays were common in winter expeditions. Families assumed the group had simply extended their journey or were waiting out a storm. But as days turned into a week, unease grew into alarm. On February 20th, search parties were finally mobilized. Volunteers, students from the Polytechnic Institute, military personnel, and local Mansi tribespeople fanned out across the snow-covered wilderness. The search area was vast, brutal, and unforgiving. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Winds howled across exposed ridges. Visibility was often measured in meters, not kilometers. Then, on February 26th, the searchers found the tent. It was located on the eastern slope of Kholat-Syakhl, a mountain whose name, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people, translates to Dead Mountain. The tent was partially collapsed, buried under snow, but still standing. And it had been cut open from the inside. Not torn by wind, not ripped by an animal. Cut, deliberately, with a knife. The scene inside the tent was a snapshot of chaos frozen in time. The hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged, Boots were lined up. Food was stored properly. Cameras, diaries, and maps remained untouched. There were no signs of an attack, no signs of struggle. But the tent had been slashed, and the hikers had fled into the night, most of them barefoot or in socks, some without coats. Whatever had driven them from that tent had been so terrifying, so urgent, that they had abandoned the only shelter they had in sub-zero temperatures. The first two bodies were discovered on February 27th, roughly a mile and a half from the tent, at the edge of a forest near a large cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko lay frozen in the snow, wearing only their underwear. Their hands were burned, and branches near the top of the cedar tree had been broken off, suggesting they had climbed it, perhaps to see something, or to escape something. At the base of the tree, rescuers found the remains of a small fire. It had burned out hours, maybe days, before. 3 more bodies were found over the next few days, spaced out along a path leading back toward the tent. Igor Dyatlov was found first, frozen in a position that suggested he had been crawling uphill. Zenaida Kolmogorova was found next, her hands clenched in fists. Rustem Slobodin was the third, his body stiff and curled. All 3 appeared to have died from hypothermia, but their positioning told a story of desperation. They had been trying to return to the tent, trying to survive, and they had come agonizingly close, dying within a few hundred meters of shelter. But 4 members of the group were still missing. It would take another 2 months before the final bodies were discovered, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters from the cedar tree. And when they were finally found, everything changed. Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault Brignol had not simply died from exposure. Their injuries were catastrophic. Lyudmila's chest had been crushed with such force that her ribs had fractured. The medical examiner compared the trauma to a high-speed car crash. Her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue were missing, not torn away by scavengers, but removed cleanly, as if excised. Nikolai's skull had been fractured, the blow severe enough to cause immediate death. Alexander Zolotaryov had similar chest injuries, his ribs shattered, his heart damaged by the force of impact. Yet there were no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises, no signs of a fight. The official autopsy report stated that the injuries were caused by an unknown compelling force. The examining physician noted that the force required to inflict such damage would be equivalent to a car crash, yet there were no corresponding external injuries. Even stranger, some of the clothing worn by the bodies in the ravine was radioactive. Not highly radioactive, but enough to be detected by Soviet investigators. The clothing had been cut from the bodies found earlier and repurposed, suggesting the survivors had tried to stay warm by scavenging from the dead. But the radiation suggested something else, something the Soviet government did not want to discuss. The official investigation was led by Lev Ivanov, a senior investigator for the Sverdlovsk region. Ivanov was a by-the-book Soviet official, not prone to flights of imagination. But what he found on Kholat Syakhl shook him to his core. The evidence was contradictory, bizarre, and deeply unsettling. The tent had been cut from the inside, but there were no footprints of an attacker. The hikers had fled in panic, yet their injuries suggested a massive, crushing force. Some had burns, some had radiation, some had died quickly. Others had survived long enough to build a fire, climb a tree, and attempt to return to the tent. Ivanov interviewed witnesses, including members of another hiking group that had been in the area at the same time. These hikers reported seeing strange orange spheres floating in the sky on the night of February 1st. The spheres glowed, moved with purpose, and disappeared over the horizon. Ivanov's official report initially included this testimony, but pressure from Moscow forced him to remove it. The Soviet government, in the midst of the Cold War and locked in a nuclear arms race with the United States, did not want speculation about unidentified flying objects or secret military tests to become public. On May 28, 1959, the investigation was abruptly closed. The official conclusion was vague to the point of absurdity. The hikers had died due to a compelling natural force. No further details were provided. No suspects were named. No additional evidence was considered. The case files were sealed and classified. For decades, they remained locked away in Soviet archives, accessible only to a select few. Families of the victims were told to stop asking questions. The Dyatlov Pass Incident became a whispered legend, a ghost story told in dorm rooms and around campfires. But the truth, whatever it was, refused to stay buried.
In the absence of official answers, theories multiplied like frost crystals on a winter window. Some were plausible, some were wild. All were attempts to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in the senseless deaths of 9 young people. Theory 1. Avalanche. The simplest explanation is often the most likely. Perhaps an avalanche had struck the tent in the middle of the night. The hikers, fearing burial, cut their way out and fled downhill. In the chaos and darkness, separated from their gear, they succumbed to hypothermia and injury. But this theory has problems. The slope where the tent was pitched was not steep enough for a traditional avalanche. Experienced investigators found no evidence of avalanche debris. And if an avalanche had struck, why were the hikers' injuries so asymmetric? Why did some die with crushed chests while others froze to death unharmed? In 2021, a scientific study proposed a delayed slab avalanche, suggesting that the hikers' actions in cutting into the snow to level their tent site could have triggered a collapse hours later. But this still doesn't explain the radiation, the missing tongue, or the strange lights reported in the sky. Theory 2. Military testing. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were a strategic military zone. Rocket tests, nuclear experiments, and classified weapons programs were conducted in the region. Several of the hikers, including Yuri Krivonishenko, worked in nuclear facilities and had security clearances. Some researchers believe the group accidentally wandered into a restricted test zone. Perhaps they witnessed a rocket launch, a parachute mine test, or a thermobaric explosion. The compelling force that killed them could have been a shock wave. The radiation could have come from contaminated materials. The panic could have been triggered by the sound, light, and pressure of a nearby detonation. The Soviet government's decision to classify the case files would make sense if it involved state secrets. Ivanov himself, decades later, hinted that he believed military involvement was likely, but that he had been ordered to suppress this line of inquiry. But again, questions remain. Why would a military test occur so close to a known hiking route? Why were there no traces of shrapnel, chemicals, or explosives? And why did the government allow search parties to comb the area if it was a sensitive military site? Theory 3. Infrasound. In the late 1990s, researchers proposed a more exotic explanation, infrasound. This is sound at frequencies below the range of human hearing, typically below 20 Hz. Infrasound can be generated by natural phenomena, including high winds passing over mountainous terrain. Studies have shown that infrasound can induce feelings of extreme anxiety, panic, dread, and even hallucinations. In confined spaces, it can be physically painful. If the hikers were exposed to sustained infrasound inside their tent, it could explain their sudden, irrational decision to flee into the night. This theory is elegant and scientifically plausible. The Ural Mountains are known for strong katabatic winds. The tent's location, on an exposed slope, could have created the perfect conditions for infrasound generation. But infrasound doesn't explain the physical injuries, it doesn't explain the radiation, and it doesn't explain the missing tongue. Theory 4. Paradoxical undressing and hypothermia. Medical experts have pointed to a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. In the final stages of severe hypothermia, victims often remove their clothing, believing they are overheating. This could explain why some of the hikers were found in their underwear. Similarly, terminal burrowing, another hypothermia behavior, causes victims to seek small, confined spaces, which could explain why some bodies were found in the ravine. This theory addresses some of the behavioral oddities, but it still doesn't account for the crushed chests, the fractured skull, the radiation, or the decision to cut the tent open in the first place. Theory 5. The Mansi Tribe. The indigenous Mansi people lived in the region and considered Kholat Syakhl sacred. Some early investigators speculated that the hikers had trespassed on a holy site and were killed in retaliation. This theory was quickly dismissed. The Mansi had no history of violence against hikers, and forensic evidence showed no signs of hand-to-hand combat. Moreover, Mansi guides assisted in the search and recovery efforts, expressing genuine grief over the deaths. Theory 6. Something else. And then there are the theories that defy conventional explanation. UFOs, secret experiments in mind control, Yeti, interdimensional portals. These ideas are often dismissed as fringe nonsense, but they persist because the official explanations have been so unsatisfying. Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator, decades after his retirement, stated in an interview that he believed the deaths were caused by an unidentified flying object. He described seeing burn marks on trees, melted snow, and the testimony of multiple witnesses who reported glowing orbs in the sky. Whatever the truth, the theories share a common thread. None of them fully explain all the evidence. One of the most perplexing aspects of the Dyatlov Pass incident is the presence of radiation on some of the victims' clothing. The levels were not high enough to cause immediate harm, but they were detectable and unusual. Yuri Krivonishenko worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, one of the Soviet Union's most secretive nuclear production sites. In 1957, just 2 years before the incident, Mayak experienced a catastrophic explosion, the Kishtim disaster, which released massive amounts of radiation into the environment. Krivonishenko had been present during the cleanup. It's possible that his clothing was contaminated from his work, and that this contamination was later transferred to other garments, but this doesn't fully explain why only certain articles of clothing tested positive, or why the radiation was found on victims who had no connection to nuclear work. Another possibility is that the hikers encountered radioactive debris from a failed rocket test. The Soviet R-7 rocket program was active in the region, and accidents were not uncommon. If the hikers stumbled upon wreckage, they could have been exposed to contaminated materials. Or perhaps the radiation is a red herring, a detail that seems significant but ultimately leads nowhere. For 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident remained officially closed. But in 2019, under pressure from the victims' families and a renewed wave of public interest, the Russian government reopened the investigation. This time, investigators focused on 3 primary theories: avalanche, hurricane-force winds, and military involvement. After a year of analysis, including computer simulations and consultations with avalanche experts, the official conclusion was released in July 2020. The government determined that a slab avalanche had struck the tent, causing the hikers to flee in panic. Their subsequent deaths were attributed to hypothermia and trauma sustained during their chaotic escape. The families were not satisfied, neither was the public, because the new investigation ignored or dismissed much of the evidence that made the case so perplexing: the radiation, the missing soft tissue, the massive internal injuries without external trauma, the strange lights in the sky. The 2020 conclusion felt less like a resolution and more like an attempt to bury the case once and for all. Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor, lived with the weight of the Dyatlov Pass incident for the rest of his life. He became a guardian of his friends' memory, speaking at conferences, preserving their diaries, and fighting to keep the investigation open. In his final interviews before his death in 2013, Yudin expressed frustration with the official narratives. He believed something extraordinary had happened on that mountain, something that the Soviet government had covered up. He noted that his friends were experienced, rational, and not prone to panic. For them to abandon their tent in the middle of the night, in lethal cold, without proper clothing, something truly terrifying must have occurred. Yudin also mentioned a detail that has haunted researchers. Igor Dyatlov's final diary entry, written on January 31st, the day before the group reached the fateful campsite, contained an unusual sentence. "We now understand that the snowmen exist." The entry was enigmatic, possibly a joke, possibly a reference to something they had seen or heard. But Yudin believed it was significant. He believed his friends had encountered something they couldn't explain. Today, the Dyatlov Pass Incident has become a cultural phenomenon. Documentaries, books, films, podcasts, and video games have explored every angle of the mystery. The pass itself has become a pilgrimage site for adventurous hikers and amateur investigators. In 2013, the mountain was officially renamed Dyatlov Pass in honor of the group. A memorial plaque marks the site where the tent was found. Every year, dozens of expeditions retrace the hikers' final steps, hoping to find new clues, to experience the mountain's atmosphere, to understand what happened. But the mountain keeps its secrets. Perhaps that's the most unsettling aspect of the Dyatlov Pass incident. It resists closure. It resists easy answers. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, the fragility of our certainty. 9 young people walked into the wilderness with dreams, plans, and futures. They never came back. And despite decades of investigation, millions of words of analysis, and countless theories, we still don't know why. The Dyatlov Pass incident reminds us that the world is stranger, darker, and more mysterious than we like to admit. That even in the age of satellites, surveillance, and scientific rationality, there are still corners of the earth where the unknown waits, and sometimes it waits in the snow.